Okay, so hello. Good evening and welcome. I'm Stephanie Birtles. I am a professor here in the Beatty School of Business and the director of our Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight. We are gathered here today on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And for me, that means a responsibility to engage in good relations and to also be a part of the stewardship of this place. And so I'm grateful that we're here tonight, and I hope that this conversation helps to bring about some of that relational spirit. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation. It's hosted by SFU's Department of Economics in collaboration with the School of International Studies, the Beatty School of Business, and UBC's Vancouver School of Economics. And so it's really nice, actually, when we hold these kinds of events and we start to come together. And I will just keep talking, but I'm sure you all can hear me. I project quite well. So it's really delightful that we're able to come together in this way, and it's a way for us to create new connections. And so thank you so much for coming together and bringing us together. So our format tonight is a very simple one. We begin with a chat with Christopher Blattman, who is the Ramilly Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago. Chris will share insights from his recent book, Why We Fight: The Roots of War and the Path to Peace. So drawing on decades of work in economics, political science, psychology, as well as real-world interventions, Chris lays out fundamental causes and remedies for war, explains why conflict occasionally wins over compromise, and shares how peacemakers often turn the tides through tinkering, not transformation. So our conversation moderator this evening is SFU Economics Associate Professor Chris Bidner. Chris is an applied theorist working on topics in development economics and political economy, and I think he should be a really excellent guide for our conversation this evening. So after our initial conversation, we're going to be opening it up to your questions. So we have a format in which you'll be invited to submit your questions using slide.com for those of you who've brought your devices. And we'll explain how that works by entering a little code with #Blatz for the event. And then during the Q&A, Patrick Francois, who's the director of the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC, will be bringing forward and elevating these questions to add to our conversation. So with that, I turn things over to Chris and Chris.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Actually, if it's possible, do you mind if we just flip one slide over? That will give us the...
There it is.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we're going to try something in order to harvest the Q&A questions. So if you use your phone, go to slido.com and put in Blatz, where the hashtag thing is, you should be able to enter your questions, and then Patrick, as Stephanie said, Patrick will sort through them toward the end. Okay, well, Chris, we're here to talk about your book, and let me say that I think this is it's a very nice book to read, but it's an important book. Okay, so I think it's concerned with the topic, violence, conflict, and war. This is a topic that we're all really quite familiar with. It's in our history books, all throughout our culture, in our video games, in the news lately, of course. And the book really suggests that our thinking on this very consequential topic is not as clear as it perhaps could be. Okay? So I think we've got a lot to learn from this. So if you don't mind, let's start by discussing some of the common pitfalls in understanding violence.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm an Ottawa boy, so it's nice to come home to a degree, even if it's several thousand kilometers in that direction. It still feels like home. So I would say the number one mistake, which is a mistake I made for most of my career, is, look, if you work, I started working in northern Uganda in the midst of a very brutal civil war, and then I moved to different conflict zones in Africa before going to work in South America, and then I moved to the city of Chicago, where the thing that happens when you move to Chicago is everyone says, why do you work on violence over there? We have a lot of violence here. And I started working on that when I moved. And you become a little bit like an emergency room doctor who only ever sees terminally ill patients. And then you start to forget that people are healthy. And so that happens actually to all of us, because we open the newspaper, and what do we, you have to flip through. No one opens a newspaper anymore, right? You flip through on your phone 18 pages of Ukraine news. And so we're focused on the terminally ill patients, and then we start to forget that the normal state of humanity is good health. And so most of the time we don't fight. And one of the things that struck me 2 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I sort of accidentally stumbled upon an article, and it said that yesterday India accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan, and common suit. So it was nothing happened. And in some sense, that's the same story that's been playing out for decades and decades. There have been days when that conflict has flared up, but most of the time it doesn't. So in some sense, there should be a Globe and Mail or a New York Times article every day that says, hey, India and Pakistan didn't go to nuclear war again. But we don't do that, right? So that has like two really big consequences. The first consequence is we get really demoralized. And so you'll start to hear things like humanity's natural state is war, and that we're inherently violent and aggressive, which actually is not true. And the second thing, which is the worst mistake, is you get really, really rotten at diagnosis. So if you only, if you're a doctor and you only ever saw sick people, and you never had healthy people to compare them to, and you forgot to compare them to, you'd be rotten at diagnosis, and then you'd have terrible treatments. And that's kind of the world we're in. So someone will say, oh, let's look at the wars that happened. Let's look at World War I. Let's look at the Russian invasion of Iraq, and let's trace back what happened beforehand. And then you'll find poverty and ancient hatreds and fallible leaders and on, climate shocks and all these sorts of things. And you think, oh, that must have caused the war. But if you actually trace back from the conflicts that don't happen, you actually find an awful lot of ancient hatreds and fallible leaders and climate shocks and poverty and all these things. So that's probably not the cause of war. And so we so economists and political scientists, we call this selection on the dependent variable. You only look at the times peace failed. And so this is kind of a book about what happens when you stop doing that, and now it changes how you think about why we fight.
Yeah, so war, I guess, because it's so dramatic, it really draws our attention to particular cases.
Yeah.
I guess
No, we want our doctors to focus on the sickest patients, right? So that makes sense. We just don't want them to forget that we're also mostly healthy and we can get better.
Right. You also mentioned there's this common misunderstanding, or this difference between hostility and violence.
Right.
And that's sort of something that I thought was very obvious ex post, but
Yeah.
a very useful frame to think through some of these things. Do you want to talk a little bit about
Yeah.
this?
I mean, so I like to say enemies prefer to loathe in peace. Hobbes knew this. Hobbes, when he wrote the Leviathan, he wrote that the natural state of humanity is war, and he spelled it W-A-R-R-E. All right, what did he mean by war? He actually, a very common misreading is violence and violent war. But that's not what he was talking about. He meant that it's sort of this like hostile contest. And that is the natural state of humanity. We're constantly, bitterly contesting with an adversary. We loathe in peace, but actually it's the thing we don't want to do is we want to avoid violence at all costs. It becomes a last resort. And principally because it's just so ruinous. And if we ever forget this, we're reminded every time there is violence. Like, look at what happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's economy has shrunk by half. The Russian economy is set back at least 2 decades. And then there's the soldiers, the civilians dead, the buildings and the rubble. But every single nation on the planet is in turmoil. Food prices, oil prices, gas prices. So it's costly. And so as a result, most of the time we strive to avoid this.
Right, so would it be sort of somewhat accurate to say understanding the roots of war is synonymous with understanding the reasons why we don't come to some sort of peaceful compromise.
Yeah.
Right, so I mean, I think this idea is probably, bits and pieces of this idea will be very familiar to many people depending on which particular academic background you've come from. But this is, you know, if you look at the book, there's really something for everyone. There's, what would you say, history, psychology, economics, probably political science, you might call it political science.
Yeah.
So what you've done, it seems, is sort of bring together these ideas that are sort of out there and put these ideas for what we would expect conflict resolution, why this natural process of negotiation breaks down.
Right.
Right. So
and I wrote the book, and so this isn't really a book about my ideas. This is like the first thing I like to tell people, that it was a book born of frustration because there are things that I learned 30 or 40 years ago, and that paper or book had been written 15 years before that in my field, which is economics. Then I became a political science professor. I married a psychologist, wrote papers with her, and then I find myself doing sociology as my day job. So I kind of tried to bring it all together because I couldn't believe it took me 40 years to find out about some of these ideas once I learned about them, because they weren't being handed to me in an easy way. And then a lot of the people I met didn't hear of them either. And so, you know, University of Chicago economists, which technically I guess I am, are not supposed to believe that like there's dollar bills lying on the sidewalk, because that would be a failure of efficient markets. But there are dollar bills lying on the sidewalk everywhere. Like people, and somebody, so that's like this with the book. It's collecting all the dollar bills lying on the sidewalk that are inefficiently there, that shouldn't be there, but they are. And so packaging them together for like people to sort of, at least sort of get some of these lessons and then in a somewhat digestible way.
And I'm very glad it was you that decided to package them all up. The book is full of interesting illustrations from Liberia to Chicago, Colombia, all over the place, full of great stories that really bring to life these ideas that would otherwise be rattling around the ivory tower. Just before we move on, I just wanted to talk about one consequence of this idea that normally we would negotiate rather than destroy surplus by fighting. And I think this is an underappreciated idea that you mentioned, and the idea is that peace doesn't necessarily mean rainbows and happiness, right? It's not necessarily fair or moral, ethical, or anything like this. Did you want to?
Yeah, so, well, there's two kinds of peace. And so there's a sort of a peace studies kind of world, and they talk about negative peace and positive peace. And I don't use those terms in the book, but you would understand it as like, there's peace in that we're just not shooting at one another, but we're on the cusp, right? It feels very fragile. But there's a strong incentive not to, but we're hostile. And then there's something called positive peace, which is to say that we've just built all sorts of insulation and padding from this conflict. And so that we're not on that brink, right? Because nobody likes to live in a world of brinksmanship. We lived in a world of nuclear brinksmanship until roughly 1990, and then it felt like, okay, we can come back from that. And all of a sudden, in the last 7 months, we're back creeping, and it's miserable and it's scary. And so negative peace isn't good enough. And so the first half of the book is kind of about why we fight. The paths to peace is partly about building that positive peace. It's how do we build all that padding around us, and how have societies, what have successful societies done to avoid this?
One sort of technique you use in just framing the very general approach of the book is this beautiful metaphor of flying in a gorge. If you could sort of just maybe describe what that means,
right.
I think it really sort of sets apart your approach from other approaches. Maybe like historical approaches where you would look at a war, trace back the preceding events and so on. I think this is great.
Sure. Well, I probably have to maybe I'll take a step back and say, so I said most of the time we don't fight, and we don't fight because it's ruinously costly. But I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight. Right? I wrote a book called Why We Fight, because we do. And so if we don't fight because it's costly, when we do fight, every time we fight, it's because a leader or a society ignored or are willing to pay those costs of war. So that's like, if you remembered one thing, war is what happens when somebody who decides on war or not has ignored those costs of war. And then the book is about 5 reasons why. That, in some sense, to my surprise, there's a war for every reason and a reason for every war, but to my surprise, there's really sort of 5 common logics. So we can kind of categorize those reasons. And so the narrow gorge is about saying, well, as each of those 5 reasons pile up, it's sort of like providing you narrower and narrower room to maneuver. And we can talk about the 5, but that's to me is what, like when we say, what's a fragile state? We have fragile states. What does that mean? Well, sometimes it's kind of a meaningless term sometimes. But to me, what it means is that we still have this incentive for peace. Like, that's the good news, right? Peacemaking isn't like working against the grain. It's working with the grain, because this powerful incentive that you can harness, which is nobody wants to endure this misery, but the walls close in. And so peacemaking is about figuring out where those 5 are operating and like just pulling them back and sort of flying in more open skies, where you can afford mistakes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the thing I found most compelling about it is you might have said, the reason the plane crashed was because it clipped a rock or clipped the side of the gorge. Now, that's true, right? But why? But the real problem, of course, is that there's no room to maneuver in the first place. Right? And so focusing on, so I guess that's the technical reason, the technical definition of roots.
Right. Well, I mean, like, so every kid in school learns that World War I started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But that's not why World War I started, right? There are a number of fundamental factors. Like, people, like in the century before World War I, lots of important people were assassinated. There were all sorts of moments of brinksmanship, and they didn't go to war. Something else, other factors had come in, and that made the situation very vulnerable. And to sort of go back to our emergency room, our emergency room analogy, the people in our society who are most ill, they usually die of something very simple, right? It's a flu or pneumonia or something, but that's why they perished, but that's not why they died. There was a cancer, there was a serious illness, or there was any one of a number of things. And so that's what it kind of means to sort of be like a sensible doctor when thinking about conflict, is to sort of course you have to pay attention to those things. You want to protect people from the flu. We don't want archdukes assassinated. But we don't want to sort of only dwell on that. And yet all our history books sort of seem to dwell on these idiosyncratic factors.
Yeah, it's this beautiful point. Like I say, once you lay it out, it's really sort of straightforward, and it's remarkable that there's this body of work that's got some ready-made answers as to what those 5. So what
one would hope that like 50 years of all the smartest social scientists had like figured something out about this, right? So
yeah,
so I'm going to get a lot of credit for these being brilliant ideas, but I don't really deserve that credit.
I mean, it's in that sweet spot where this work's being done, but it hasn't been dragged out into the public square. I mean, when I first read Fearon's paper, the same thing. It's a very simple paper, but this rationalist explanations, it really opened up a lot of things for me. So why don't we give a brief overview then of those 5 reasons why peace can break down?
Sure. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is on a lot of people's minds for obvious reasons. So let's use that as an example. And the place to start is to realize that even here, war was a last resort. So for 20 years, Vladimir Putin tried every other underhanded thing possible to co-opt Ukraine's politics short of invasion. Assassinations and dark money and propaganda and support for separatists. So war was a last resort. And it's a strategy that he has employed against most of his neighbors, Belarus, Kazakhstan, etc., again, without having to employ violence, right? So in general, this is a strategy that works. The strong want most of the pie. They get most of the pie most of the time. That's true for the United States as well. And it happens peacefully. It doesn't have to be equal or just. It's just fighting so costly that the weak generally yield. That's negative peace, right? We don't have to like it, but it's maybe better than, sometimes it's better than war. So why didn't that happen this time? What went wrong? Well, the first reason is we ignore the costs of war is because the person who decides doesn't pay those costs. And so the classic example is a personalized dictator like Vladimir Putin, but really any leader in our society who's insulated from the costs of war is going to be more ready to use violence. All right, so it might not take you all the way to war, but it makes it very fragile. The gorge narrows for our pilot. Moreover, when a leader, especially a personalized dictator, thinks that their regime is more likely to be preserved through warfare, then they have an incentive to do it, even if it's against the interests of the wider group. And to some extent, I'm not sure it was decisive, but to some extent, Putin could look across the border at Ukraine to a people that Russians identify with more than any other people on the planet, and they'd thrown out two Russian-facing presidents in the last 20 years. And so to the extent that that is a threat to his control of the regime, that's an added incentive to extinguish that. So that's number one, what I think of as unaccountable or unchecked leaders. The second is what I think of as intangible or ideological things that we gain only through warfare, or that decider gains. And so you've all heard this already. Every time you've read in the newspaper that Vladimir Putin is seeking personal glory or place in history, or maybe more plausibly getting the empire back together, addressing past humiliations, all these things I think are true to an extent. That's a set of things that essentially makes him averse to compromise, even if it's in his group's best interests, right? He's willing to pay some costs of war in order to achieve it because he values this ethereal, intangible, ideological objective.
So this is preferences.
So this is basically, so to an economist, this would be preferences.
Sorry, to an economist, right.
Right.
Yeah.
So we can translate, we translate into economics, uncountable leaders, we call that agency problems. This is non-standard preferences. We value things that only war can deliver. Likewise, there's a story on the Ukrainian side. Belarus accepted a weak deal, and Kazakhstan did, and Ukrainians said no way. They found this compromise that would give them a smaller share of the pie repugnant. And this is actually the story of every freedom fighter and revolutionary in history, whether it's the American revolutionaries or the Mau Mau in Kenya or the Algerian independence movement, is yes, there's this tyrannical superpower that is offering us semi-sovereignty, and most of the others have accepted it, and we reject it. We say no way. Why? Because it's a repugnant compromise. So it would just be too high a psychological price to pay. So that's a kind of story. And it may or may not be true, but at least now you understand what kind of story it is. The third story that you hear in the newspapers is one of, I call, misperceptions. And this is the idea that they just got the costs and benefits of war wrong. They made a mistake. And humans and organizations are capable of making mistakes in really persistent ways. And a classic one is in the one you hear in the newspaper about Putin being an isolated, insulated leader. He's isolated and insulated from the truth, as most autocrats are. This is a classic problem of autocrats. They, in order to sort of coup-proof themselves, they're sort of surrounded by yes men and women. And so they get bad information, and so they misjudge the chances of, underestimate the costs. This is also a story people tell about the Bush administration, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the repeated intelligence failures, and the failure to sort of send bad news up the chain. So this isn't limited to autocracies, although it's usually worse. So that's a story of misperceptions, right? So we're not paying the costs, we are willing to pay some costs for an ideological objective, or we underestimate the costs. Those are three. And
sorry, misperceptions would be private information or something?
You would persistently erroneous beliefs.
So
I'm persistently overconfident about my chances. Even after, for example, even after 19 years of losing in Afghanistan, we can still believe that if we pull out our troops, that government will stand, right? There's a certain level of persistent delusion that even really sophisticated democracies seem to be capable of.
So this is if I'm right, this is the contact you're making with psychology. These are sort of
psychology, behavioral science, behavioral economics.
Right.
The thing is in behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, we spend a lot of time focusing on things like why do we buy gym memberships and then never go, right? We make a persistent set of errors that I'm going to go to the gym. All right, and we have a whole catalog of mistakes that humans make. But in that that's not very useful for understanding conflict. One is because there's certain kinds of mistakes that when the stakes get really high, we stop making those mistakes. Like if my gym membership cost $1 million, I would think harder about it. Also, there's nothing strategic about that. I don't have to like guess what another actor is doing, right? Because I don't have to worry about what the gym manager is going to do in response. There's a whole other set of mistakes we make when we're trying to characterize the actions of another person, especially someone we loathe. So, and we don't talk about that. Psychology doesn't do a lot of work on that. Economists, political science does a little bit. And so partly I've tried to catalog the mistakes, the institutional mistakes and the biases we make over and over again. And I think one of them, I could talk endlessly about those. One of them I think is this sort of insulation from bad news and not having enough no men and women around you in an institutional capacity. But there's all sorts of psychological errors great leaders make all the time. I mean, why do we have a mutual fund management industry? Right? This isn't politics, right? But high-paid people get other high-paid people to give them billions of dollars, convincing themselves that they can beat the market, and none of them ever beat the market. Year after year for 30 years. And so they make this persistent error. Right? So that kind of overconfidence, and then we elect one of them president or prime minister, and they think, oh, I can beat the market, I can get, we can win against so-and-so. That's a persistent error. That's a problem if that's systemic. Or if we systemically select people to become mutual fund managers who are delusionally optimistic, maybe we systematically select prime ministers and presidents who are delusionally optimistic, and so that's a problem.
I don't want to interrupt the last two or three you're going to, but this is, I found this part fascinating as well. Is this the sort of area where you would slip in your quote from Dostoevsky about how you can, nothing's easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing's more difficult than to understand it. So this is not sort of an individual misperception, but it sort of shows perhaps a little bit how a whole nation can kind of get swept up.
Yes, yeah. So, so one of the interesting things that happens when we, over and over and over again, when we encounter an adversary with this sort of long-standing, loathsome relationship, is groups seem to have a really persistent capacity to misjudge the actions of the other group in a way that leads to bad decisions. There's a really famous book called The Person and the Situation. And it's an early social psychology contribution that since then I think there's just a lot of evidence for this, and it's kind of depressing. It says, suppose Eric here is an Israeli soldier, okay, and I'm a Palestinian politician or something like that, and my side, kills somebody from his side, okay? I'm gonna look at this and I'm gonna see all the circumstances. Like he was scared and under a lot of pressure and the Israeli soldier was doing this and all these sorts of things, right? And I'm gonna attribute a lot of his actions to the situation and I'm gonna be somewhat understanding. But if the exact same thing happened by one of Eric's people, I have a tendency to blame it on internal factors, like his racism or hatred, or I don't see the situation. I don't see the situational factors. I see the internal biases and hatreds. And so that's a problem, right? And I'm a little bit blind to that on my own side. We just make that mistake over and over and over again. And it characterizes that conflict. It characterizes ethnic conflicts. It characterizes religious conflicts. Frankly, every one of us has someone in our life, our mom or our son or somebody that like we actually might have this sort of kind of poisonous, rigid relationship with, where like the person you get angry with like that, right? It's a very similar kind of psychological mistake that when they do it, we blame the person, and when we do it, it's the situation. And then we find ourselves in these explosive arguments of misunderstanding, and they go on for 30 years in our most important social relationship. All right? So groups seem to be, it's different, but groups seem to be capable of some of the same misunderstandings. Mm-hmm. And so that ends up being that sort of hijacks this thinking, right, these rational calculating people who are saying, oh, should we go to war, should we not, there's costs, and it becomes somewhat unthinking. And so that's this whole bucket. So this misperceptions bucket is huge. There's lots of different biases. I talk about what I think are the important ones in the book, and then also what things have been successful at rolling those back.
Do you want to, let's cover the remaining two,
yeah,
I think, and then we can delve into that stuff a bit more.
Sure. So, okay, so back to misperceptions, right? So Russia, Putin, the insulated, isolated leader, misjudged his chances of winning against Ukraine, right? So it must be a misperception. Well, this is actually a mistake we make all the time. I think that's true. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I want everybody to think back to 7 months ago at how uncertain was the West's resolve and unity on something like sanctions, on how uncertain was Ukraine's pluckiness, military ability, and how uncertain was Russia's military capability, right? And the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three of those things was always within the realm of possibility, but nobody predicted it. And so it's a very uncertain environment, right? And in an uncertain environment, there's the possibility of making a bad choice. Or sorry, you have to make a gamble. And when that gamble goes wrong, we love to say, oh, that was a misperception, he made a mistake. When you're like, actually, it's not wholly clear that this was the wrong gamble to make, because it was a gamble that worked against Kazakhstan and Belarus, it was a gamble that worked in Syria, and it was a gamble that worked here and there, and Obama drew a red line, and Trump drew a red line, and all these people drew it and crossed it, and nothing happened. And this time, it didn't go so well. And then you have to add something. This is where the strategy comes in. This is where some of the economics comes in, is that uncertainty is hard to resolve. And it's hard to resolve for a very simple reason, which is you don't trust anything your enemy tells you to the contrary. Because the West says, no, 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 we really mean it. We drew the red line this time. We really mean it. And we did. And Ukraine's like, no, 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 we're not like Belarus. Like, we are super, we will fight to the last man or woman. And why can't you believe that? Because you're worried it's a bluff. And so now there's a strategic dilemma. And anyone who's ever played poker gets this. You already get this already, even if you haven't applied it in this context. So your opponent has a hand, you don't know what hand they hold. You hold a hand, they don't know what hand you hold. Your optimal strategy is not to bluff none of the time. You all know that. And you also know your optimal strategy is not to bluff all the time. All right? And in response to that, your opponent knows that the optimal strategy is not to fold all the time. And the optimal strategy is not to call all of the time. Amidst this uncertainty and this risk of bluffing, your optimal strategy is really clear. You bluff some of the time, probabilistically and somewhat unpredictably. In response, you call or invade some of the time, unpredictably and probabilistically. And that is the tragedy of this uncertainty. And so we have to really resist calling these things bias and misperceptions and recognize that there's some like fundamental other strategic impediments that come from uncertainty that actually probably matter for every war you've ever heard or care about, but we often don't. It's nuanced, and nobody tries to tell people about this, and so it's not out there.
Yeah, that's right. It is nuanced, and it's much more digestible when you get a few pages of different engaging stories to learn about it. So I think, like I said before, you tell it in a way that probably only a handful of people could have. Then there's the last one.
Right.
The most beautiful one.
The last one is the worst word or phrase in all of like social science. It's commitment problems, and it just doesn't make any. What does that mean? Like it's not evocative, and yet it's maybe the most important thing for understanding political competition and violence in the world. And some people have gone to say that it's maybe the one thing that explains every long war in history. I don't think it explains this one so well, but it explains a lot. The classic example is what some people call the preventative war, right? So your enemy is rising, and you have a choice. We can lock in our advantage now by invading, or we can wait for them to rise, and they're promising that they won't squelch us at that point. But I can see lots of reasons in which they have an opportunity to renege, and so I don't want to gamble on that. And that's a logic that people use to understand World War I, not like the assassination of an archduke, but the rise of Russia and Germany's concerns about its inevitable, essentially crushing by this bear next to them. The US invasion of Iraq, right? And the belief, even in the tiniest chance of Saddam either having weapons of mass destruction or being able to develop them again in future, completely changed the balance of power, could not credibly pledge not to restart that weapons program in the future. If you believe that, you have a commitment problem. Probably not true here. I think the four we just went through explain a lot of the rationale for Russia invading Ukraine. But the sense in which I think this is useful is I do think it helps us understand the timing a little bit. Because you can make a very strong argument that in January 2022, Russia was at its peak leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine, maybe forever, because Ukraine was acquiring all sorts of defensive technology, drones from Turkey. All these Neptune missiles that we've heard about that are sinking ships in the Black Sea. Those just didn't appear in February. They'd been developing those for several years, thinking they would use them. The Russians knew about that. They were growing closer to the EU and sort of seemingly inexorably coming out of Russia's grasp. And Russia's economy has been stagnating for 5 years, 6 years. And Ukraine as well, but had really nowhere to go but up. So there was an argument that actually there wasn't so much a commitment problem, but there was still this sort of now or never logic that would have influenced, and again, getting back to this narrow gorge, amidst this set of factors that had left such a slim margin for peaceful compromises, something like this can set it off.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the book has just got so many interesting details, and I really could talk to you for hours for this. Of course, I won't. One thing that I've sort of noticed is that these 5 things get a lot of airplay, but the second part of the book is just as interesting and just as packed full of important lessons.
I'm not paying him to say this, by the way. He's very generous.
Well, okay, yeah. So, at the risk of skipping ahead too much, I'd like to just sort of move to sort of the real value of understanding the reasons why compromise fails, and that is to think more clearly about how to generate peace.
Yeah.
So there's many different things we could talk about. One thing that sort of stuck out to me as an economist was this idea of capitalist peace, right? So capitalism, greed, globalization has this bad image, bad perception out there, but you make the case, not as starkly as this, but you make the case that capitalism is a force for peace. Mm-hmm. Do you want to elaborate on this?
So as a broad framework, I sort of walk through, there's a whole set of solutions. There's I talk about checks and balances on political power and how that's maybe one of the most fundamental things pushing towards peace. I talk about predictable rules and enforcement, like the state, and which is over decades and centuries solved each of these 5 problems. And I talk about interventions like mediators and peacekeepers and things. And when all of these work, they work because they're solving one or more of these 5 problems. And so something like and then there's a whole group of things that I think of as our interdependence. And we could have ideological interdependence. So I care about the costs to the other side because I think of you as a fellow human being. It gives me a little, right? That's what the Enlightenment gave us. So I feel a little pain. So the war's even more costly than before. Or we share an identity, right? So you might be a Protestant and I'm a Catholic, but we're both of the same class, or we're both of the same profession, or we're both of the same something, right? We share an identity, so I feel a little bit pain. We might be friends and socially interacting, or we might be economically intertwined. And so economic interdependence, it's not like a magic solution, right? We've had all of these great wars. Germany spent 30 years embracing Russia, buying its gas in it was an explicit strategy to bind Russia so close economically that it wouldn't turn to violence. And the United States and most of the West has done the same with China in the last 30, 40 years, hoping that it would lead to amicability rather than violence. That's part of the strategy. And it kind of works, but it's not a magic solution. I think of it as like speed bumps, right? So if I know that, like, actually, like, my economy is going to shrink 10% because we've entwined ourselves if we go to war, that is an added disincentive. And so it's sort of just, you know, so it's not a magic solution, doesn't swing us into these open skies, but it sort of opens that canyon or gorge a little bit. And so that's sort of the arc of the second half of the book, is rolling back the 5 things that were causing you to fight.
Right, and these 5 logics sort of manifest themselves in ways that I think are counterintuitive in many respects. So this one about capitalism being good, a really counterintuitive one was about foreign aid being a force against peace. So the logic there, I guess, was not all foreign aid, but probably what the aid that acts to centralize.
Right. Yeah, it cuts both ways.
Yeah.
It can cut both ways. Like, some foreign aid just is a pipeline of cash into the finance ministry. And that just increases the lack of accountability of that ruler, right? So there's a personalized dictator who's just getting that pipeline of cash, and everybody in the country has to come to them with their bowl, and that's a tremendous amount of power. Foreign aid operated like that for a long time. That's an oversimplification, but it centralized power, and that not only made leaders less accountable, it meant we're more subject to their idiosyncratic ideological objectives, to their misperceptions, and dictators find it really hard to make credible commitments. So we have more commitment problems. It just accentuates all 5. Now, but there's a lot of foreign aid, cash transfers to the poor, school building, literacy, clinics, business development, industrialization, industrial policy, trade, helping them build, fostering a textile industry. All of this is pulling, like, economic and other kinds of power outside of the hands of this narrow elite that runs a lot of countries, and putting in a broader set of hands and making those leaders a little bit more accountable, right? So when election violence starts to break out in Kenya, as it does each election, the president gets 14 calls from all of the business elite who are like, what are you doing? And he gets 14 calls from all the politicians who half own the factories that the business elite are running, and none of them have a stake in this, and they, like, take care of it. And it's not a magic solution, but it's really important.
Sort of along these similar lines of these interesting, somewhat counterintuitive consequences of these 5 logics. So I was really drawn by this argument about having a taste for violence as an explanation for why we fight. And I guess it's mostly men, stereotypically. The argument is, we like watching MMA or something and shooting video games and this sort of stuff. Actually, when I first opened the book, just randomly, it was on this page that was talking about hooligans in the UK. I must say, it sort of rang something inside of me. There is something that is possibly violent inside. And so one sort of natural proposal to deal with that would be to have women in power. And so you have this section where you mention whether that's a reasonable or a logical solution. Do you want to
talk about that?
Yeah.
So yes, it would help, but not for the reasons I think most people think it would. So it is true, men are more aggressive. Men are most of the soldiers, most of the generals, most of the brawlers. There are biological and social reasons for there to be more aggression. And for interpersonal violence, this is like first order. And then the interesting thing, which didn't have to be true, but the interesting thing that when you study group behavior, like when you have groups that are deliberating over high stakes things in politics, it's not that like bravado or machismo or things don't matter at all, but they tend to dwindle. They're actually one of these mistakes that we don't make as seriously once we're in groups, right? Lots of mistakes we do make in groups, that doesn't seem to be one of them. And then there are all these interesting studies where people have cleverly found ways to find out what happens when you do have more women leaders. And frankly, they behave mostly like the men. Now, one reason is partly because, well, most of that government is probably still male. So it's not really, we don't really have, it's not like we can look back in history and sort of see, well, what happens when like the majority of the government is female? We don't have that experiment. But I just think it doesn't matter. We're getting distracted. The fact is if you're in a society where 50% of the population, I don't care if it's women or an ethnic group or a religious group or whatever, if 50% of the women or of the people are disenfranchised, then the leadership gets to ignore most of the costs of war to them, right? And so they're inherently unchecked and unaccountable because half the costs of war they can sweep under the carpet and they're that much more ready to use violence. And so when you enfranchise half the population, you're checking and balancing power in that society and you're compelling leaders to internalize the costs of war. And so they're less likely to do it. So that's like the first order thing that matters. And maybe the aggression thing matters too, but I think it's a distraction from like the fundamentals.
Yeah. Just mindful of time. Again, toward the end of the book is really interesting because you sort of go on to this path where you think, okay, I understand the 5 logics. Now I see war from a different perspective. And then you sort of hit us with, well, there's still things about solving peace that you probably don't appreciate being true. And so I happened to have got fascinated by this idea of wicked problems that you had talked about, right? And so the idea that so I suppose the idea is, humans have done all these remarkable things, right? We send this spaceship to bump into the asteroid and this and that, but things like, a few blocks over with drug abuse and homelessness, reconciliation, and war, we haven't seemed to resolve these things. So I'd never really thought about it before. What's the properties of these problems that make them somewhat immune to resolution?
Well, I do want to get to Q&A, so maybe a short answer. I'll take it back to my medical analogy, and I apologize if there's any doctors in the audience because maybe I'm totally skewing your discipline and getting it wrong. But okay, I had to take my 9-year-old son to his pediatrics appointment a couple of weeks ago. He has like a raspy voice. It's probably nothing, but they're like, it might be something. And so for 2 years, the doctor's like, okay, why don't you try an allergy pill for 8 weeks? Okay, now why don't you try this, and why don't you try that? And she doesn't know what exactly the problem is, and she's approaching it in like this sort of piecemeal way, and trying to change one thing at a time, and then at some point she'll figure out, she's diagnosing what the problem is, and at some point she'll figure it out, and then maybe the diagnosis will be something they're like, aha, we have this treatment that works in this situation, we can take it off the shelf. Or maybe not. Maybe they'll have to experiment with a few different treatments to figure out what works. And all of us have probably had an experience like this. And if you went to your doctor and with the raspy voice, and she said, you know what, we're going to do Tylenol and radiation. We're going to cover all the bases. And you'd be like, the first thing you would do is you would get a new doctor, right? You would inherently understand that the problem is more complex. And then we go to the poll booth, right? And you have to elect a new mayor of Chicago or a new mayor of Vancouver, and you're worried either about homelessness or drug use or gun violence. And we don't want our mayor to say, well, we're not sure, we're going to try a little bit of this and try a little bit of that, and we're going to slowly die, and then, there might not be an off-the-shelf solution. No, we want the mayor of Chicago to come in and say, well, New York did this, it was a magic solution, we're going to do it. Right? We want like a simple, and so we're all capable of having this like complex brain that understands that there's complex problems when it's close to us, and then you just get it a little bit distance from us, and we make this classic mistake. And so I could have ended the book saying, now we have the 5 answers, and just 10-step plan for peace, listen to me, buy my book, World Peace in 50 years. But that's not what I really believe. We have to sort of be a little bit like doctors and diagnose in that way. And then remember to understand that our politicians ought to be like that as well, and stop rewarding them for giving us Tylenol and radiation.
Yeah, probably easier said than done, but very timely with these local elections. Patrick, are you okay if we go to the Q&A? So as a reminder, hopefully you've managed to enter your questions if you have some using those details.
And I think you can upvote questions as well, is that right?
Yeah, I think you can like them and they should raise to the top. So what's going to happen is Patrick's going to read some of the top questions out. We're going to try, see if this is an innovation over the usual way.
Face-to-face questions, because if I use technology, the whole room will blow up.
So you want to ask a face-to-face question?
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't you go first and then...
Should I just talk?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for sharing. I identify myself as a justice-friendly pacifist. So need justice before peace. So you educate yourself and work with people at the grassroots level. But my question, let me just get back. There is a question why we fight. I was wondering who is we? Because are you referring to the warlords or politicians or military? Because sometimes we assume that it starts from the bottom up, but it's, as you said, half of the people are ignored.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't include women. No. And then the roots of war. Why don't you use the roots of warlords? Because again, because I grew up in the 60s where we didn't differentiate war from warriors. I'm sure you are my same age as me. But now I'm 74. But I wonder, now they seem to be, we oppose war, but we celebrate the warriors. Parents would oppose the war, but they would celebrate. They don't want the children to go to war, but they would still celebrate warriors. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I actually think this is one question because, rather than two, because the answers are very similar. The we in some level is every level, because my day job is not working on like Ukraine versus Russia, and like a lot of people in this room, like 8 months ago, I could not have found Donbass on an unlabeled map. So I'm not an expert. I worked in ethnic conflicts in Africa and in civil wars for many years before, where there's a lot of warlords. And then for the last 5-10 years, I've been working on gang warfare in Colombia and Mexico and the United States. So very low level. But the answer, like why we fight, part of the answer is these are all really different kinds of conflict. Gang warfare is different than civil wars, it's different than ethnic conflict, it's different than great power war. But, and as a social scientist, your job is to like narrowly study one of them and become an expert. And that's fine, but I wanted to like bring it up and say why we fight is there's actually something we can learn that these things have in similar. But the thing that they have that are similar is that most of the time when we fight, it's because it's not the women and the children and the disempowered and things who are doing they might be enrolled in they might be drafted to be the soldiers, but they're not the ones deciding. One of the real common features are these sorts of centralized, unaccountable leaders for the reasons I just said, not just because they can ignore costs of war, but because we're prone to their ideological pursuits, their misperceptions, which can be very institutionalized as a function of being unaccountable, and there's lots of uncertainty surrounding them, and they can't make commitments. So I do think, and that's a kind of warlordism, right? Gang warfare in Chicago is a kind of warlordism. The warlords I met in Liberia were warlords, but Putin is also kind of a warlord. And so it's this warlordism, which is kind of like this unaccountable power of these deciders who can take the rest of the society to war outside of its interests. And so that's really one of the most persistent problems.
I should mention, if anybody else feels they're technologically challenged and would like to put up their hand, we're very happy to entertain that. But perhaps let's go to Patrick.
Okay, so I'll just read them by the upvote. Lots of great questions here too, and if there's ties, I'll indulge in them. But anyway, the question...
You might get a microphone. Hang on a second.
Oh, okay. So, is that working? No.
He has to get back to the sound booth, probably.
Okay. Well, I'll shout until it starts to get unbearable. So, has war become less common through history? Mm-hmm. If so, what factors have made us better at finding peace? Mm-hmm. And what does that teach us about the future of war? Yeah.
So, it depends what kind of war we're talking about, or fighting we're talking about. Steven Pinker has this very famous, excellent book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he makes this argument that life has been getting more peaceful over time and it's likely to continue. I think that's half true. In terms of interpersonal violence, in terms of small group violence, gang violence, and civil wars, for most countries on the planet, there's just been a tremendous fall in the likelihood of us getting killed in that kind of warfare. And There's several reasons for that, because, and so there's some parallels to the way I look at it through a different frame, but that integration, the economic integration, the social integration, the ideological integration, the checks and balances, states that have rules and enforcement, all the interventions and mediation and things that we've developed, all of these things have, where we have them, have contributed to this decline. And the other thing, war's gotten more costly because we have nuclear weapons now. That's an added deterrent. So we go to war less often. When we do have war, unfortunately, it's a doozy. What I think has not changed is the probability of international conflict very much. I think it's gone down a bit, but I don't think all of these fundamentals have eliminated international conflict. Rather, what I think has happened is it comes down to international conflict is more costlier than before because our weapons are more destructive, and so we should expect to see it happen less frequently. And when it does happen, it'll be really bad.
So the last part of that question was, what does that teach us about the future of war? And your answer is we should expect it to persist pretty much the way it is.
Well, I think we have to think about okay, we've been amazingly successful within our societies and within regional spheres of creating unprecedented peace. So how do we incrementally go in that direction internationally? And there's a lot of answers. But I mean, the platitude would be, better international institutions. What would that mean concretely? I mean, the invention of International Criminal Court has been a tremendous innovation. Very, very important, has really changed the conduct of a lot of warfare. And unfortunately, 2 or 3 very large countries, including the United States, have not signed on to it. I think it's possible that they could sign on. I think in a moment like this, you could see that I think the possibilities are greater for this. And so I think there would be a set of things on the margin that one could agitate for in one's country to move that needle.
So related to your now or never logic, somebody's asked China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
Question mark.
Yeah. So I'm pessimistic in the sense that I think there's a very real probability of not only of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but then this turning into one that embroils the United States and some of its allies. I still think on the balance of probabilities it's not going to happen, but it's much higher than I'd like. So why do I think that? Well, let's think about this framework. Most of the time we don't want to fight, right? So you have 2 adversaries, right? You have one side, and you know, I said sometimes peace is unequal because the powerful party gets what they want. That's, you basically, if there's a pie that you're trying to divide, if you have 90% of the ability to burn the house down, you can probably expect to get 90% of the pie. And so the thing that's unstable about the current situation is we have Taiwan and China, or you could think of Taiwan and its allies, Japan, Australia, the United States, Canada, etc. One of those has increased its economy and its military prowess by a factor of 10 in the last 40 years. Okay? And so when you get more military and material power, you expect to have more of the pie. You expect to get more of your way. And it wants more of its way in Taiwan. And so Taiwan can either acquiesce, or like the Ukrainians who refuse on principle, they can choose to fight. And most of the time, people acquiesce. And this is an instance where I think they will not. And it appears, somewhat to my surprise, that the United States, because the strategic stakes of the United States on going to world war over Taiwan are not obvious. No single president has articulated why it is in the national interest. I can think of reasons, I might even support them, but no one's articulated why we would move towards World War III in a clear way. That's kind of an amazing thing. But it seems to be the case that the United States and Taiwan are either bluffing, or they really mean it, and they are not going to acquiesce towards giving China what it thinks it's due, given that its increase in bargaining power. So this is a story of, this is squarely in that ideological incentive, that there's a deal to be made because one side is incredibly powerful and the other side is refusing to make it. And I happen to think that's noble and important, and I would like to think I would have been a freedom fighter at any point in history, if I was born into any one of these places, but I also know that doesn't always happen. So I think that those ideals might actually carry us to war.
Okay. So why do we tend to focus only on the sickest of the sick patients? So Ukraine's on the headlines, but what about other conflicts?
I think, okay, so, I mean, one of these that I think is a really important one, because I think it will only grow in importance over time, is urban violence across the Americas. So many American cities, many Latin American cities, San Salvador, Medellin, Rio, Tijuana is recently, are often somewhat peaceful. And then when the gangs in that city go to war, they become the most violent places on the planet by, 10 times more violent than any civil war that's happened in the last 20 years. And they're typically fighting over drug rents. Not just, sometimes it's the drugs that are being trafficked to rich countries, but often these cities have developed retail drug markets locally. And even if they no longer participate in the international drug trade, they are fighting over drug rents in that city. And now we have we have 2 or 3 continents full of large populous cities, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, with, again, medium strong governments. Right? Mexico's not a weak state, Colombia's not a weak state, yet they have this problem. The United States is not a weak state, and they can't stop this violence. And they don't yet have drug trafficking, and they don't yet have a retail drug market. And the question is for how long? And so and nobody's sort of saying, let's get the jump on this. Let's make sure that Nairobi and Lagos and Mumbai and Jakarta and whatnot don't develop a retail drug market and drug gangs. Because then we'll all look like Tijuana and Rio. And so I fear that that's what we can expect in a lot of our middle strength states around the world in 50 years, is that they sort of look like that, and that's pretty scary to me.
So what's your view on appeasement and deterrence as preventative measures for war?
My view of what?
Appeasement and deterrence as preventative measures. Can one of them be more effective than the other, and if so, in which scenarios?
So on some level, appeasement is what we call compromise when we don't like it. That's not entirely true. I think that's partly true. Appeasement is also, but actually appeasement is like a dog whistle for a commitment problem, or a fear of a commitment problem of a certain kind. It's to say, if we give Hitler this, or if we give Putin this, or if we give so-and-so this, then they're just going to take something else, and then something else. And each time they do it, they're going to get more powerful, and then they're going to take something else. So it's like a slippery slope kind of argument. And that may or may not be true, right? Because if we don't agree with the compromise, of course, we'll always make the slippery slope argument. But the slippery slope argument is sometimes real. And so I think the real fear of appeasement is when we fear that, like, there will be this cascade effect of making a concession. And so you have to take a stand now. Now, very often I think there's not a real commitment problem, and that's just a reasonable compromise. But just the fact that if we can just think about it more clearly and then look for the answer, I think it'll allow us to judge when appeasement is compromised versus like a real commitment problem.
So I think there's a hand over there somewhere. Does somebody? Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, you touched on Middle American conflicts with gang violence and drug lords and that sort of stuff. I did write it in the online one, but it has like character maps, so I couldn't get the whole idea through. In South America, there is a lot of deep wealth inequality. And in the last couple years, last couple decades in particular, there's been a huge increase in social violence and domestic violence, in class warfare in the state of like people being attacked in the street. But that's all within a society. That's within a most of these places are developing countries. The government has a strong hold. So what could governments be doing to deal with social violence that is springing up like a sort of pandemic?
Yeah, so I think so. Inequality is one of these things I think is just intrinsically problematic, and as societies we should try to reduce it. And I feel the same way about poverty. I feel the same way about climate change. Yet I don't think any single one of these is a major cause of violence. Of course it causes a little bit, but why is that? So most societies for most of human history have been grossly unequal. You've had a small elite group dominating the masses. And 99 times out of 100 or 999 times out of 1,000, the masses don't revolt, right? They loathe one another in peace. So that's when you pointed out that peace doesn't have to be just. That's negative peace, right? So I'm not saying let's have a world where we have peaceful inequality. That's not the world I want, right? But I want us to understand that the incentives are pointing towards peace. And so if we want to understand why societies are fighting, it's probably not because they're unequal. I think we should tackle inequality. I spent half my career actually studying poverty reduction because I care about it, but I don't think it's going to solve violence very much. The only sense in which I think it indirectly contributes to a positive peace and more insulation is to the extent it's less about, to the extent that it actually pulls power in the hands of a very centralized elite and then reduces this problem, the centralization of power. But then I want to label the problem a lack of checks and balances on decision makers in society. And then there's lots of ways to do that. Like making everybody a little bit more literate, a little bit richer would be okay. That would, maybe, and then you don't sell your vote as much. And that matters. But frankly, if you want to think about like how to check the power of elite in society, like a Politburo is better than a personalized dictator. And crony capitalism is better than a Politburo. All right, and so not that I want like the World Bank or the US, USAID or the Canadian, Foreign Affairs to say crony capitalism is our strategy for peace in Africa, but that's kind of what we want to do subtly. We want to say, let's actually build, there's something called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that enables an enormous amount of textile production in African countries that then gets exported to the rest of the world. It's a phenomenal program, and it's been a huge check and balance on power in those societies. And I think that to me is where I would, and by the way, the people who get those jobs, eventually, that actually does a lot to help poverty over time as well. So I'd like us to squarely think about how practically the limited tools we have as outsiders can actually check and balance power in a really meaningful way in a short span of time, rather than get wrapped up in inequality causes conflict.
Okay, so here's a fun one. The US could take over Canada any time. So what stops it?
Usually I get why isn't the United States going to have a civil war? They don't say why don't we invade Canada?
No one's thinking of us.
That's right. No, listen, the world would be, Canadians wouldn't be very happy, but the world would be a much better place with 26 additional seats in the Senate that Canadians vote for. I think there would be, if Canadians had, that would be the most selfless and peacemaking act on the planet, is to join the United States, add 26 seats to the Senate, whatever to the that's it. We're many fewer invasions. I realize it's not going to happen. And so first of all, let's just put it, half the people half of the United, because the simple answer might actually be that the people in power in the United States half of the time know that they would no longer be in power if they took over Canada. But at the end of the day, it doesn't, it would be too costly, and so easier, maybe not to loathe in peace, but to sort of find alternative ways to compete and compromise.
So let me just push back on that example. George Akerlof used to say he didn't celebrate Independence Day in the US because he said, if we hadn't fought, we'd be Canada. That'd be so much better. Anyway, so
Patrick, there's just one back here.
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Maybe it's related to this.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the NSA actually has what-if scenarios about taking over Canada.
Yeah.
It is an inevitability, and you know why?
No.
Anybody have an idea of why the states will take over Canada?
Water.
Exactly.
Oh, I see.
At some point when the level of water availability in the states is low enough, there'll be a phone call from the president to the prime minister, and the prime minister is probably going to ask for a couple of days to at least give the appearance of resisting, and then there'll be a peaceful takeover. But they always say this has been on books for years.
So we don't, I have no doubt someone has this word game. We don't have data on that. We do have data on what happens when water sources disappear in lots of other places, and does that escalate conflict? And you would think so, right? Because water conflict, you read about it in the newspaper all the time. Actually, but that's because we're looking at the water conflicts that happened and not the ones that didn't. So actually, like when water becomes scarce, there seems to be no relation to increased likelihood of invasions or conflicts. What's going on, and why would I say there's not going to be a conflict, is because invading Canada would be the worst way to get the water.
There won't be a conflict.
Yeah.
There's going to be a phone call, and then
Oh yeah, the
Yeah,
capitulation.
yeah.
Yeah. Enemies of the peace. I mean, I think it's easier to. Often it's easier to trade. I mean, I think they'd try. I think it would be easier to buy the water, and leverage then whatever political power they have to get a very favorable price. But that's what, because we like to think of the United States as having acquired most of its territory through warfare, but actually it bought most of it from other nations. And so at the end of the day, most polities would rather trade than fight.
My understanding is that under the NAFTA agreement, once we start selling bulk water to the U.S., we're kind of locked into it. Mm-hmm. So maybe they have no reason to try and conquer us.
Trade than fight, rather trade than fight, exactly.
So here's a question about sort of citizenship. So how can constituents who are ignored by war-making leaders make themselves heard?
That's a good question. So I think, so in the book, I said like two sides, they each have bargaining power that's driven by the amount of guns that they have, or the amount of military might and the material might they have. And if you're China and you grow and you get more weapons, you expect more of the pie. Or if you're a government and you control all the weapons and the economy, you expect most of the pie, and you usually get it. But there's another kind of power, which I think of as mobilizational power. Right, so in my class, when I teach my students, as like a little meme, I say, well, it's three M's. It's military, material, but there's mobilizational power. And so I think when societies, or when the masses, or when civilians are better able to exercise voice, and better able to coordinate themselves, and whether that's through social media or really effective advocacy or things, they're often, that's a kind of influence. And so I think that's been one of the more effective tools that's been wielded, and sometimes it's not enough. But I think we owe a lot of. That's a really important check and balance on power.
Hi. I wonder to what extent the 5 mechanisms you've identified all fall within the framework of looking at war with a negative lens. Mm-hmm. You probably know political scientists also look at war in favorable terms.
Yeah.
Right? War is sometimes a way to peace. And another political issue that has been in the headlines are the Iran protests.
Yeah.
Right? And if anything, we would love it if the Iranians had a leader who would give a call to arms. And we would love it if the Iraqis and the Turks gave them arms, and we could get rid of the Islamic Republic, and the world would be a better place with a democratic Iran. At least no fear of a nuclear war in the near future. So how does this favorable view that we have sometimes to certain people fighting fall within the framework of the 5 mechanisms you've identified? Because we do seem to have duplicitous opinions about fighting when it comes to fighting for the purpose of peace.
Okay, so I think there's two things come to mind. So first is that I think in general, I think fighting is still typically your worst option for achieving one's political aims. However, there are circumstances, there are a set of circumstances, like perhaps Ukrainians facing an ideological or intransigent Russia, or perhaps Iranian, like the Iranian mass is facing like an ideological and transigent group that is in some sense refusing to make the reasonable compromise. So when the other side is refusing to make the compromise that your bargaining power suggests you deserve, either because you can mobilize people or you have the material might or the military might, then fighting is your best option. Because they're making either a mistake or they're valuing something that you don't value, and the compromise, that is your best route. So I think that actually is the story of every liberation movement in history to some extent. And so that's maybe a subclass of times when but it's only optimal to fight because the other side has this other thing going on. There's another story that's told in political science about the only reason we have strong states and democracy is because of war. And this is the story that most famously told by Charles Tilly, that warfare in Europe over 300 or 400 years forced states to eliminated weak states, kept the strong. We only have income taxes and state revenues and public goods because all of these things appeared in warfare. And therefore, if we didn't have war, we wouldn't have these long-run benefits. And so it's this like hidden long-run benefit. I think that's partly true. I think it's mostly false. I think it's mostly false, again, because we're selecting on the dependent variable. We look at this one episode in history when good things happened, and then we look at every other incessant bout of warfare in human history in any other part of the world at any other time, and it didn't result in this. So we can't just pick and choose the one weird instance where a good thing emerged. And what's more is actually, a lot of the time, I think strong states and democracies have actually emerged out of peaceful competition under the threat of war. So the last 100 years, I've worked in Africa a lot of my career. The last 100 years, you've seen massive amounts of state development and democracy in Africa. Where have you seen it? Have you seen it happen in the more the warring countries? No. You've seen it in Ghana and Kenya, and you've seen it in the most peaceful countries. And so there is an alternative path to all of these good things that I think does not always go through warfare.
Time for one more?
Yeah, so I think, I'm sure there are lots of questions, but we do have a reception and some beer and such, so perhaps if we have one more question and then we'll stick around and you can ask Chris in person.
Okay, so this is a bit closer to home, so, with the kind of basically the stagnation at the bottom end of the income distribution, you talked about inequality not being that important, but the question we're getting here is that what's stopping the trucker convoy and the January 6th insurrectionists in the US from being more violent? And ultimately, they've got nothing to lose, and that disenfranchisement would suggest more of that, wouldn't it?
So I think there's a difference between sporadic, relatively disorganized political violence by disconnected individuals and small groups, which is a danger and has actually been a problem in the United States for roughly 200 years. Let's be clear, right? There's a lot less of that than there was 60 years ago when there were lynchings, and so there's always this, and that was far more organized. There's a difference between that and like a sustained, an organized political movement that's strategically choosing to use violence as a way to gain power. And so I do worry about this sort of sporadic, disorganized violence going up. I think one of the funny things that happens in a lot of countries, in a lot of places, is that suppose you're some disaffected kid or disaffected old guy or whatever, and you think, what do I do with my disaffection? Oh, people here in my group seem to do this, right? They protest and they march. Oh, I'm going to do that. Or people in my group, they seem to blow up public buildings. Maybe I'll download some stuff from the internet and do that. That's a norm of what do I do? What's my repertoire in this society? I think we're in a world where that's a real danger in the United States. But I think the chances that gets organized and we get a Northern Irish style insurgency are vanishingly small for lots of reasons. But I don't want to belabor people with this. But I do think we do have to worry about disorder. But that's not why we fight. That's a little bit different. That's not about organized group violence. That's a different phenomenon. We should be worried about it.
Okay. Well, it seems a shame to cut cut it short here, but let's, if you would join me in thanking Chris. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And like I mentioned, we have a reception out here. Grab a drink and something to eat, and hopefully you'll get a chance to ask Chris some more questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.